The dead man's garden had dry soil for 3 months. The irrigation system was broken. But the bushes were perfect. The geometry was flawless. I understood this when the investigator showed me the photographs. Ivan Petrovich maintained the form, ignoring that the roots had long been dead. He did the same with people. 22 years ago, he saved my family from ruin. Since then, I was his project. Education biology, a reasonable choice. Work school, they need you here more. Personal life, she doesn't understand you. Every decision of my life was made by him, and in his notebook he wrote, "Fully formed." The night before his death, he called me to the garden. He talked about the foundation, about succession, about how I was ready to lead his cause. I made tea, herbal, calming, 15 grams of hawthorn instead of 5. Not a flash of rage, cold calculation, like a biologist correcting an experiment. He died on the bench where he shaped my life, and I grew crooked for the first time. In the early morning hour, when the small town still slumbered under a heavy blanket of fog, Helen Hayes crossed the street with a trash bin in her hands. The dumpsters stood across from John P. Miller's house. After tossing her bag, she turned back and noticed the garden gate was ajar. It swung in the wind, emitting a low, monotonous creak. Helen frowned. John never left his gate unlocked. Through the gap between the gateposts, she could see a metal bench under an apple tree. An immobile figure in a light-colored shirt sat upon it. Helen took a step closer. The posture seemed odd. The back was too straight. The hands rested symmetrically on the knees. The chin was lowered precisely, as if the body had been carefully arranged. It wasn't a person resting. It was a statue.
"John?"
Helen's voice trembled. There was no reply. The silence that followed was heavy, disturbed only by the rhythmic squeak of the gate. She pushed it open with her palm, the hinges groaning dryly as she stepped onto the gravel path. The fog swirled around rows of boxwood, trimmed with geometric precision. The edges of the flower beds formed perfectly straight lines, not a single branch out of place. She reached the bench, the gravel crunching under her feet. As she drew nearer, it became terrifyingly clear that John wasn't asleep. She touched his shoulder. The fabric of his shirt was cold. Her fingers recoiled as if burned. Taking a step back, a leaden weight settled in her chest. Her gaze fell to the flower beds, where the earth was cracked and dry, resembling a parched riverbed. She glanced at the house, saw a coiled black hose by the wall, and noticed the twisted tubing of a drip irrigation system. The spigot was turned off as tightly as it would go. With trembling hands, Helen pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Detective Alex Nolan arrived 40 minutes later. He stepped out of his unmarked car, buttoned his dark blazer, and walked toward the house. The town was just beginning to stir. A few figures had gathered by the gate, whispering among themselves. Helen stood apart, hugging her elbows. Nolan nodded to the medical examiner, already hunched over the body, and entered the garden. His steel-gray eyes scanned every surface methodically, fixing on the details. The geometry of the shrubs, the perfectly trimmed edges. Not a single stray branch or weed. The tools, a shovel, shears, a rake, were stacked against the wall with an apothecary's precision, their handles all facing the same direction, their blades polished clean. He crouched by a flower bed, running his fingers through the soil. The top layer crumbled into dust. He took a pinch, rubbing it between his fingers. Dry. It hadn't been watered in a long time. Nolan stood, walked to the house wall, and inspected the black drip irrigation tubing. The hose was twisted at its base. The connecting valve was cracked. The spigot was cranked so tight it looked like someone had used a wrench. He took out his notebook and made a brief entry. Irrigation system. Damaged. Soil parched. inconsistent with a caring owner. Nolan turned back to the bench. The M.E. stood up, pulling off his gloves. "Preliminary finding is heart failure," he said quietly. "We'll know for sure after the autopsy." Nolan nodded, his gaze returning to the garden. Everything was neat, everything in its place. But it was dying of thirst. It was as if someone had been maintaining an illusion of control while ignoring the grim reality. More residents began to arrive. Principal Samuel Grant was one of the first. He moved through the small crowd, patting a shoulder here, offering a sympathetic nod there. His voice rose above the others. "They don't make men like him anymore." Several people echoed similar sentiments, as if reciting lines from a script. The phrases merged into a monotonous chorus. Nolan listened closely. The intonations were identical. The grief felt like a pre-approved text. No one asked about the cause of death. No one approached the body. They all stood at a safe distance, as if afraid to disrupt the garden's composition. The detective understood. The town had already written its version of the story. The natural death of a respected man. No doubts, no inconvenient questions. Nolan pulled out his phone and found the number for the local high school. The call was answered on the second ring. "Anthony Collins, this is Detective Nolan. I need you to come down to the Miller residence to make an identification." Anthony arrived 20 minutes later. The teacher got off the local bus at the stop near the corner store, walked past the crowd, and paused at the gate. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his fingers gripping the strap of his satchel. His eyes fixed on the bench under the apple tree, then slid to the flower beds, and finally to the hose. Principal Grant intercepted him at the garden entrance. "John was always so proud of Anthony," the principal said, placing a hand on the teacher's shoulder. Tony nodded without replying and stepped inside. Principal Grant remained outside, shaking his head with a heavy sigh. Tony stopped a few feet from the body. He stared longer than was necessary for an identification. Nolan watched from the side, noting the length of the pause. It wasn't shock. It was something else. Tony's eyes traced the lines of the deceased's hands, his chin, a crease in his shirt. Then he nodded. "That's John P. Miller." His voice was even, without a tremor. Nolan approached him. "When was the last time you saw him?" Tony turned to the detective. "Last night. We sat right here, drank some herbal tea." "What did you talk about?" "The town's development fund. John wanted to create it. He offered me a position on the board." Nolan took out his notebook, jotting down the time and duration of the meeting. "Who made the tea?" "John did, but I brought the herbs from the school lab." The detective looked up. "What kind of herbs?" Tony listed several names: mint, chamomile, lemon balm, rosehip. Nolan wrote down each word, underlining the last one. "How long were you together?" "About an hour, maybe a little more. Then I left. John stayed in the garden." "What was his condition?" "Calm. Tired, but normal. He was talking about his plans for next week." Nolan closed his notebook. "Thank you. We may need to speak with you again." Tony nodded and walked out of the garden. His gait was measured, but his fingers gripped his satchel tighter. Nolan moved to John's office, located behind the main floor of the general store he owned. The room was small and neat. A dark wood desk, stacks of documents arranged in tidy piles. A pen lay perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. A mechanical clock ticked off the seconds with monotonous regularity. The detective opened a desk drawer. Inside, he found 5 brown-covered ledgers. He pulled one out and opened it. It was filled with tables, names, dates, sums of money, brief character assessments. Miller, J., $500. Roof repair, October 2018. Reliable. Evans, H., $300. Salon opening, March 2019. Promising. Nolan flipped through the pages. The records spanned years. Some entries weren't about money, but about people's personal qualities, evaluations, predictions. It was as if someone had been documenting not an accounting history, but a process of formation. He returned to the garden. Tony was standing by the gate talking to Principal Grant. The detective beckoned the teacher over. Tony approached. "You need to see this," Nolan said, opening the ledger to a specific page. Tony read the entry. Collins, A. $800, tuition, family support, 2015 to 2018. Promising. The teacher's eyebrows drew together. "The amount is wrong. It was less, around 500. Principal Grant, who had followed him, chimed in. John was meticulous. He never wrote anything down by accident. Tony didn't respond. His breathing deepened slightly. Nolan noted his reaction. The detective turned to the last page of the final ledger. There, a concluding entry stood alone. Anthony, the most successful project, fully formed. The handwriting was confident, not a single correction. The date was from 2 days ago. Tony read it in silence, his lips pressed into a thin line. Principal Grant shrugged. It's a figure of speech. John loved his metaphors. But Tony wasn't smiling. His gaze hardened. His fingers twitched, as if he wanted to snatch the ledger and slam it shut. Nolan saw the movement. Tony reached for the document. The detective instinctively pulled the ledger back. The teacher's palm landed on top of Nolan's hand. The contact lasted a second longer than necessary. No one said a word. Principal Grant looked away, clearing his throat awkwardly. Nolan calmly placed the ledger in a file. These documents will remain part of the case file. Tony lowered his hand. His position had shifted. He was no longer just a witness. He was now a potential figure at the center of the investigation. That evening, Nolan received the preliminary forensic data. He called Tony and asked him to come to the station. The teacher arrived half an hour later and sat across from the detective in a narrow office with gray walls. Nolan placed a printout on the desk between them. Substances that increase cardiac stress were found in John Miller's blood. Tony sat up straighter. What kind of substances? The detective named the chemical compound. Tony nodded. That's characteristic of certain herbs, especially in a concentrated infusion. The concentration was higher than normal for casual use, Nolan added, his eyes fixed on the teacher. Tony explained the properties of the substance, mentioned dosages, and described the reaction of an elderly person's system. He spoke professionally, without emotion. Nolan listened, taking notes. This wasn't the reaction of a shocked man. It was the reaction of a specialist. Who exactly prepared the tea? Nolan repeated his earlier question. John did, but I brought the herbs. Where did you get them? From the school lab. I keep dried specimens for my lessons. The detective closed his notebook. That's all for today. Tony stood and left the office. Outside the door, he stopped, leaning his palm against the wall. A memory surfaced. The paper bag, the rustle of dried herbs, the conversation about the fund. John's voice. You'll head the education department. Tony closed his eyes. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider his own involvement. 3 days later, Nolan shared the updated results. The concentration of the substance significantly exceeded the standard dosage for an elderly person with heart failure. This was no longer a coincidence. Tony returned to John's garden. The gate was again ajar. The gravel crunched under his feet. He walked to the bench and stopped. The spot where the body had sat was empty. The metal had darkened with dew. The teacher crouched by a flower bed and took a pinch of soil. It crumbled in his fingers. He looked at the tightly shut spigot. at the cracked valve. The system hadn't worked in a long time. The control had been for show. Tony ran his palm over the dry earth. In that moment, the threat shifted definitively. The danger was not external. It was hidden within his own memory. He remembered the evening, the paper bag, the rustle of dried herbs, John talking about the fund, the mission, the importance of continuing his work. Tony had listened, holding the bag in his hands. Then he had prepared the tea, handed over the cup. Now, crouching in the parched garden, Tony realized. He remembered the dosage. He had checked the effects of the infusion. He had increased the concentration, deliberately. A gust of wind stirred the branches of the apple tree. The leaves rustled, as if whispering an accusation. Tony stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. He looked at the house, at the perfectly trimmed shrubs, at the tools against the wall. Everything was neat. Everything was under control. But there was no life. He turned and walked out of the garden. The gate slammed shut behind him with a dull thud. Inside him, the feeling of an impending revelation took root. Not an external one, an internal one. The kind that was impossible to escape. Tony returned to the school lab immediately after his conversation with Detective Nolan. The hallway buzzed with students' voices, but behind the lab door, there was only silence. He took out his key and turned the lock. The click sounded louder than usual. He rarely locked the door during school hours. The lab was always open to curious upperclassmen. Now, he needed isolation. Light from the window fell at an angle, illuminating suspended dust particles. Cabinets filled with herbs lined the wall, their glass jars reflecting the evening sun. Tony ran his fingers over the labels, checking the inscriptions. Chamomile, motherwort, valerian, lemon balm. His own handwriting, neat with a consistent slant. He repeated to himself the chemical name the detective had mentioned. Glycosides, triterpenoid acids, characteristic of hawthorn in concentrated form. When the dosage is exceeded, it increases the load on the heart. An elderly body reacts sharply. Tony stopped at the section for cardiac blends. A light rectangle was visible on the shelf, the ghost of a jar. Hawthorn. He remembered its presence distinctly in the spring, a 16-ounce glass container filled with dried berries. Now the space was empty. He pulled out the logbook for reagents and compounds, flipping through the pages and scanning the entries. His own handwriting. Dates. Names. Not a single line about signing out the hawthorn. He checked the adjacent jars, valerian, motherwort, mint, all in their places. Nothing was missing except for that one. Tony closed the logbook. The absence of the hawthorn was no longer a simple oversight. The fact aligned too perfectly with the autopsy results. He sat down at the desk, placing his palms on the cold surface. He closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct the evening. The walk to John's house, the narrow streets of the old town, the creak of the gate, the smell of dry grass and dust. He was carrying his satchel. Inside was a paper bag. The day before, John had asked for something calming. The garden greeted him with its perfect geometry. The boxwood shrubs were trimmed to the millimeter, the bench under the apple tree. John sat straight, hands on his knees, a warm smile on his face. "Anthony, glad to see you." "John." A brief exchange. The conversation turned to tea. John boiled water in the house, returning with a teapot and cups. Tony handed him the bag. The herbs rustled with a dry whisper. "Hawthorn?" "Yes. It's calming. Good for the heart." John nodded, satisfied. He steeped the infusion and poured it into the cups. They drank slowly. The conversation deepened. The Town Development Fund. John laid out his plans confidently, without rushing. the areas of focus, the financing, the management structure. Tony listened, answering in monosyllables. John leaned forward, placing a hand on Tony's knee. "You're ready. You'll head the education department. It's a natural step." Tony said nothing, just nodded. John's smile widened, the memory sharpened, details emerging more clearly than before. Tony opened his eyes. The lab returned. The light had dimmed. Outside, twilight was gathering. At the entrance to the store, he was intercepted by Maria Vance, a slender woman with a short silver haircut. She was dressed simply, a dark dress, a long cardigan, a thin chain around her neck. Her gaze was direct, devoid of unnecessary emotion. "Anthony?" He stopped. "Maria." She wasn't smiling. John had a way of making people dependent on him. Tony frowned. He helped a lot of people. His help always came with expectations. Maria paused. John cultivated people like they were his shrubs. He pruned them, guided them, controlled their shape. Tony tried to object. He genuinely wanted what was best for the town. He did. But his care demanded loyalty. She held his gaze a moment longer than usual. "The system is cracking, Anthony. Don't try to save it." Maria turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous general store. Tony remained at the entrance, her words settling slowly, like dust after an explosion. Principal Grant summoned him to his office the next morning. "Sit down, Anthony." The principal patted him on the shoulder before taking his seat behind the desk. "I want to discuss something important." Tony sat opposite him. Grant took out a folder of documents and opened it. John prepared the development fund documents before he passed. "Everything is ready. The structure, the financing, the areas of work." Tony remained silent. "You are the natural candidate to lead the education department." Grant spoke with the confidence of someone stating the obvious. "The town expects us to continue his work. We can't let John down." "I'm not sure. Confidence will come." The principal interrupted him, his tone gentle but firm. "It's the best way to honor his memory. John would have been proud." Tony felt the role of successor being cemented without his consent. It wasn't an offer. It was an appointment. "Think about it, Anthony, but not for too long. The documents need to be signed by the end of the month." Grant closed the folder. The conversation was over. Back in the lab, Tony took out his notebook and transcribed the phrases from John's ledger from memory. Promising. Ready. Transfer the work. The most successful project. Fully formed. Each word landed like a brick in a wall. John hadn't just been planning financial transactions. He was building a system of succession. Tony was a part of that system, the central part. He allowed himself to think, the death could have been advantageous to one of the debtors, someone tired of the control, someone who wanted to be free. The thought brought a brief sense of relief. The responsibility shifted outward. Tony wasn't the author. He was a witness. But the relief didn't last. Tony went to John's garden under the pretext of checking the irrigation system. No one had mentioned it was damaged, and Tony wanted to see for himself. The gate was ajar. He pushed it open. The gravel crunched under his feet. A gust of wind slammed the gate shut behind him. The metallic clang cut the garden off from the street. Tony turned. The gate was closed. He was alone among the manicured shrubs. The space felt tighter, more constricting than before. The house walls on one side, a high fence on the other. The geometry of the flower beds resembled a labyrinth. A wave of claustrophobia washed over him, as if the place itself wouldn't let him leave. He walked to the wall of the house and crouched by the irrigation system. The black drip tubing was twisted at its base. The spigot was turned off completely, a thick layer of rust covering the metal. Tony tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. He ran his hand over the soil. The top layer crumbled to dust. The earth wasn't just dry. It was dead. He pressed harder. The surface disintegrated, revealing gray stones beneath. Tony understood. Water hadn't reached these beds in months. The garden's perfect appearance was maintained without any real care. Order for the sake of form. An illusion of control. Among the shrubs, Tony articulated the thought clearly for the first time. John maintained external control, but didn't care about internal growth. He recalled his own life decisions, choosing biology as a profession because John had said, "It's sensible, stable." Turning down a move to the city, "Don't rush, you're needed more here." Ending a relationship 3 years ago, "She doesn't understand you. You deserve better." Each decision had seemed reasonable. Each had been guided from the outside. Crouching in the parched garden, Tony saw the parallel. His life was the same kind of decorative order. Neat, lifeless. The thought was disturbing, but not yet an accusation. Nolan called him in again on the third day. Tony entered the detective's office. The narrow room with gray walls, a desk, 2 chairs. The window overlooked the town square. Nolan placed a printout on the desk. The final report from forensics. Tony sat opposite him, his hands folded in his lap. The detective read in a low, even tone. The concentration of hawthorn in the blood exceeds the permissible norm for an elderly person with heart failure. The overdose is minimal, but precise. Nolan looked up. Whoever did this had to know the dosage. The pause stretched. The detective stared directly at him. Tony held his gaze, but the tension mounted. "You're a biologist," Nolan continued. "You work with herbs. You know the dosages." "Yes." "Who selected the herbs for the tea?" "I brought them." "How much?" "I don't remember exactly. A few pinches?" "Is a few pinches of hawthorn a safe dose for an elderly man?" Tony fell silent. His professional knowledge had become a trap. He understood dosages. He knew how to calculate concentrations. That expertise belonged to him. "It depends on his weight, the condition of his heart, other factors," Tony answered slowly. John weighed 194 pounds. He had stage 2 heart failure. Did you know that? "I knew." Nolan closed the folder. "Thank you. That's all for today." Tony stood up. He walked out of the office. Outside the door, he stopped, leaning against the wall. The logic of the investigation was circling back to him, inevitably. Returning to his apartment, Tony sat at his desk. He switched on the lamp, its light falling on a clean sheet of paper. He remembered. John had asked for a calming blend the evening before. Tony had gone to the lab after his classes. He took down the jar of hawthorn. He poured some of its contents into a paper bag. It was easier to carry than the whole jar. He remembered opening the browser on the lab computer. He typed in a search query. Hawthorn dosage, elderly. He read articles, studied charts, noted the numbers. Safe dose. 5 grams of dried berries per 200 milliliters of water. Maximum, 10 grams. Exceeding that causes tachycardia, arrhythmia, cardiac overload. John weighed 194 pounds, stage 2 heart failure. Tony remembered measuring the herbs. He poured the hawthorn onto the scales, added a little more. 15 grams. He closed his eyes. The details clicked into place. Researching the dosage beforehand, measuring the exact amount, packaging it separately. Tony opened his eyes. The lamplight was sharp. He began to suspect himself not as a victim of a system, not as someone who had acted impulsively. He had created the conditions in advance. He had chosen. He stood up from the desk, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it in one gulp. The glass trembled in his hand. The memory was no longer blurry. It was sharp, clear, merciless. The evening in the garden. The conversation about the fund. John's words. "You'll head the education department." A hand on his knee, the confidence in his voice. Tony had handed over the bag of herbs. John had steeped the infusion. Tony had sat motionless, watching the boiling water pour over the dried berries, listening as John spoke of his mission, of succession, of duty. He remembered the weariness, not physical, internal. Years of advice, years of being shaped, years of a life guided by another's hand. And in that moment, sitting in the perfectly manicured garden, he understood. He was being shaped again. Tony hadn't acted under pressure. He had acted rationally. Like a biologist correcting an experiment. 15 grams of hawthorn. A concentrated infusion. Stage 2 heart failure. It was his first completely independent decision. Tony returned to his room and sat on the sofa. He placed his hands on his knees. His breathing was even. His pulse was calm. There was no panic, only a troubling clarity. He was not a victim of manipulation. He was the author of the act. The thought brought no freedom. It only made his situation worse. Outside, the darkness deepened. The town fell silent. Tony sat motionless, staring into the void. A feeling solidified within him. The door had slammed shut. There was no way out. Tony sat at his kitchen table. The clock on the wall ticked off the seconds with a monotonous beat. His apartment was immaculate. Not a crumb on the countertop, not a speck of dust on the windowsill. The symmetry of the objects was calming. Or it used to be. On the table before him lay a sheet of paper with a column of numbers written on it. The concentration of the substance in John's blood. Nolan had recited them calmly as facts requiring no interpretation. Tony repeated the words aloud to the empty room. Hawthorn increases cardiac activity. It overloads the myocardium. It rarely becomes the sole cause of death. His voice was quiet. There was no one to hear but himself. He remembered John's complaints. My heart's been acting up. Blood pressure all over the place. The doctors say it's my age. John would smile when he said it, a warm, almost fatherly smile. Tony had always nodded, agreed. He picked up a pen and began to construct a logical chain on the paper. Age, 62. Weight, 194 pounds. Stage 2 heart failure. Stress from preparing the fund. Overexertion. Tony added a final line. Weak heart. Coincidence is possible. The phrase was comforting. For a moment. He stood, went into his room, and pulled an old university textbook from the shelf. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. Plant pharmacology. He opened it to the section on cardiovascular agents and found the chapter on hawthorn. Returning to the kitchen, he placed the textbook next to his notes, comparing the information. The safe dose for an elderly man weighing around 200 pounds was 5 grams of dried berries per 8 ounces of water. The maximum was 10 grams. Exceeding that could cause arrhythmia, tachycardia, and cardiac overload. Tony took out a calculator. He calculated the possible blood concentration from a standard infusion and compared it to the numbers Nolan had given him. The excess was moderate, not exponential, not abnormal. He did the math on paper, checking it twice. The numbers added up. The calculation seemed logical. Science could be his alibi. Tony formulated the version aloud. John was nervous about the fund. His blood pressure rose. His system couldn't handle it. The scenario seemed reasonable. He almost believed it. Even an increased dosage might not have been the decisive factor. The heart was already weak. John had been talking about his plans, his mission, his legacy. The excitement, the adrenaline, the strain. Tony closed the textbook. He placed the pen perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. For the first time since the death, he allowed himself a deep breath. The tension eased. For a moment. The next morning, Nolan called him in again. Tony walked into the detective's office. The narrow room, the gray walls, the window overlooking the square. The cold light accentuated the pallor of his face. Nolan was sitting at his desk. A new printout lay before him. The lab recalculated the figures. Tony sat opposite him, his hands folded in his lap. The detective continued in a low voice. The concentration of the substance exceeds the level achievable through normal brewing of herbs. A pause. Nolan looked up. An overdose like this requires precise knowledge of proportions. Tony felt his carefully constructed theory begin to crumble. The numbers he had written out in his kitchen the night before were losing their protective power. Who calculated the dosage? The question was calm, without accusation. I selected the proportions, Tony answered. Nolan nodded and made a note in his logbook. The silence stretched on. The detective didn't rush him. Tony could feel each of his words solidifying as fact. The logic of the investigation was closing in, without any pressure at all. And that's what made it so terrifying. That evening, Tony went to the lab. The school hallways were empty, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the walls. He unlocked the door and switched on the light. The lab felt colder than usual. He walked over to the cabinet of herbs, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly. He hoped to find proof of a mistake, a mislabeled jar, a switched container, anything. But everything was in its place. Chamomile, motherwort, valerian, lemon balm. The labels were neat. The handwriting was his own. The empty space where the hawthorn had been was like a verdict. Tony ran his fingers along the shelf. The very orderliness of the space amplified his inner chaos. He slammed the cabinet door shut. The sound was a loud crack in the silence. A jar standing near the edge fell and shattered on the tile floor. The tinkling of glass filled the quiet room. Tony froze. He looked down. Shards of glass fanned out across the floor, the dried mint mixing with the dust. He bent down to pick up the pieces. His fingers brushed against a sharp edge, and the skin broke instantly. Blood welled up on his palm. A thin red line. He stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. He walked to the sink and held his hand under the cold water. The stream was strong. The blood washed away quickly, turning the water pink as it swirled down the drain. Tony watched the red disappear. The water carried the evidence away, easily, quickly. A thought came to him quietly. Some stains can't be washed away. The water continued to run. The cut stopped bleeding. He turned off the faucet and wrapped his finger in a paper towel. Suddenly, memory returned him to the evening before the meeting. Tony was sitting at the computer in the lab. On the screen was a medical article. The Effects of Hawthorn on Elderly Patients. He had read it methodically, paragraph by paragraph. One section had caught his attention. In cases of overdose, a sharp drop in blood pressure is possible, especially in individuals with chronic heart failure. The risk of fatal consequences increases when several factors coincide: age, weight, and the condition of the myocardium. He remembered thinking, "This is stronger than it seems." He had closed the article, opened a new tab, and typed a search query: Hawthorn overdose symptoms. He kept reading. The memory sharpened, the details becoming clearer. He remembered John's kitchen, the teapot whistling on the stove, John pouring water into the cups. Tony, holding a spoon over his own mug. John had been talking. "The fund is almost ready. The papers are signed. All that's left is to define the departments. You'll head the education one. It's a natural step." John's hand had rested on his shoulder, confident, warm. "You're ready. I always knew it." Tony had nodded, said nothing. In that moment he felt no gratitude, only a heavy internal exhaustion. The spoon in his hand had hovered over the cup a moment too long. He had added the herbs slowly. One spoonful, a second, a third. John kept talking about his mission, his legacy, his duty to the town. Tony listened. The spoon dipped into the cup again. He slid to the floor of the lab, his back against the wall, the shards of glass beside him. He understood. That evening there had been no flash of anger, no impulse. He hadn't argued, hadn't protested. He had acted calmly, methodically. The calmness made the act more deliberate. He ran a hand over his face. His fingers were cold. The paper towel on his cut was soaked through. He remembered watching John drink the tea, slowly, talking about his plans for the following week. Tony had sat opposite him, observing. He hadn't been defending himself from a threat. He hadn't made a mistake in the proportions. He had chosen to increase the dose. Tony lifted his head. He looked at the cabinet of herbs, at the empty space where the hawthorn had been, at the labels written in his own hand. The theory of an accident no longer held up. He was not a victim of manipulation. He was the author of the act. He stood up, swept the shards into a dustpan, and emptied them into the trash. The sound of glass hitting plastic was dull. He washed his hands again, dried them, and removed the paper towel from his finger. The cut had closed. A thin red line remained. He turned off the light in the lab, locked the door, and walked out into the hallway. The emptiness of the school felt more oppressive than ever. At home, Tony sat on the sofa. He placed his hands on his knees. His breathing was even. His pulse was calm. There was no panic, only awareness. He hadn't acted impulsively. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't made a mistake. He had chosen. This realization didn't bring freedom. It stripped him of the right to see himself as a victim. He remembered the line from John's ledger, "The most successful project, fully formed." Project. The word sounded precise. John had created people, guided them, pruned away the excess, shaped them. Tony was the result of that work, educated, grateful, obedient. But that evening in the garden, as John spoke of the fund, of succession, of his mission, Tony understood. He was being shaped again, and he was tired. Years of advice, years of guidance, years of a life that did not belong to him. He had increased the dose not out of rage. He had done it rationally, like a biologist correcting an experiment. 15 grams of hawthorn, stage 2 heart failure, age 62. The calculation was precise. Tony stood up, walked to the kitchen, and picked up the sheet with his calculations from the night before. His theory of an accident. He crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. He returned to his room, lay down on the sofa, and closed his eyes. A feeling settled within him. The false hope had collapsed. He could no longer pretend. The next morning he woke early, washed his face, dressed, ate breakfast, tea, bread, cheese. The movements were mechanical, habitual. He glanced at the watch on his wrist. A gift from John. Simple, without frills. Tony had worn it for years. He took off the watch and placed it on the table, for the first time in a long time. At school, he taught his class, explaining photosynthesis to the students, showing them diagrams, answering their questions. His voice was even, his gestures minimal. The students noticed nothing. After class, he returned to the lab, sat at his desk, and took out his notebook. He wrote. He didn't act impulsively. He didn't defend himself. He chose. He reread the words, then closed the notebook. That evening, Nolan didn't call. The investigation continued, but without any new questions. The town was preparing to close the case as a natural death. Principal Grant spoke of it openly. John Miller lived a dignified life. His heart gave out. It's a tragedy, but not a crime. The residents agreed. The same phrases were repeated everywhere. They don't make 'em like him anymore. He helped everyone. It will be harder without him. Tony listened and said nothing. He returned to John's garden late that evening. The gate was ajar. The gravel crunched under his feet. The garden was empty. The boxwood shrubs stood in their straight lines, the edges of the flower beds still perfect. The ground was completely parched. Tony walked to the bench under the apple tree and sat down. He placed his hands on his knees, just as John had. The spot was cold. The metal had long since lost its warmth. He looked at the irrigation system, the seized-up spigot, the cracked valve, the rust. Order without life. Tony closed his eyes. He remembered John's voice. I just want what's best for you. The phrase had sounded sincere. John had believed it. But his care demanded loyalty. His help became a debt. His advice became decisions. Tony opened his eyes. The garden remained the same. Perfect. Dead. He stood up, walked out through the gate, and slammed it shut behind him. The sound of the metal was final. At home, Tony sat at his desk, switched on the lamp, and took out a clean sheet of paper. He wrote a single sentence. It was his first completely independent decision. He reread it, then placed his pen parallel to the edge of the desk. He turned off the light and went to bed. A disturbing clarity remained within him. He was no longer a victim. He was the author. And that made everything worse. Nolan sat across from Tony in the cold light of the lamp. The detective's office was unchanged. Gray walls, a window overlooking the square, a desk clear of clutter. After a long pause, the detective spoke. Did John Miller have any enemies? The question was simple, the tone even, without a hint of accusation. Tony understood. Nolan wasn't asking for a list of names. He was asking about hidden conflicts, about motives that might lie beneath the surface. John helped a lot of people, Tony replied. He didn't have any open conflicts. Nolan nodded, made a note, and then looked up, his gaze lingering a moment too long. It wasn't a pressurizing stare, but it didn't allow for evasion. Tony felt each word settle in the space between them. The question about enemies was an invitation to offer an alternative theory, a version where the responsibility lay with someone else. But Tony remained silent. Nolan closed his notebook. Thank you. That's all. At the faculty meeting, Principal Grant spoke louder than usual, his voice filling the school auditorium, creating a sense of occasion. John Miller lived a worthy life. This town must preserve his good memory. Several teachers nodded. Someone scribbled in a notepad. Grant continued. The medical report indicates heart failure, age, stress. A tragedy, but a natural one. Tony sat in the third row, watching the principal, listening to the words. The town was constructing a collective narrative. Simple. Safe. Age and a bad heart, Grant repeated. They don't make men like him anymore. The phrase sounded like a final judgment. Tony heard those words everywhere. On the street, in the store, in the teacher's lounge. His heart just gave out. Age caught up with him. A tragedy, but natural. The collective version sounded like a relief. The town was exhaling. The investigation was winding down. Life was returning to its normal rhythm. But for Tony, that relief was a heavy burden, because the lie was being upheld by everyone. The town had chosen a myth, and Tony was left as the sole keeper of the truth. He went to John's garden late that evening. The gate's creak was no longer so sharp. The sound had become familiar. Tony pushed it open. The gravel crunched quietly under his feet. The boxwood shrubs still held their shape, but their tops were beginning to lose their sharp lines. A few branches stuck out. Some leaves had yellowed. He stopped at the metal bench, at the place where John had sat, hands on his knees, chin lowered just so. Tony felt as if the conversation about the fund was still happening in his memory. John's voice was distinct. "You'll head the education department. It's a natural step." The psychological presence was almost physical. Tony sat on the bench, placing his hands on his knees just as John had. The metal was cold. He looked at the garden, the flower beds, the paths, the irrigation system that hadn't worked in months. Two options formed in his mind. The first, accept the fund, lead the department, continue John's work, become his successor, and solidify his status as the successful project. The second, refuse, sever the connection, and leave. Tony locked his fingers together, the tension in his jaw tightening. The choice was no longer about the investigation. It was about his identity. Returning home, Tony took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door. He absent-mindedly checked the pockets. His fingers found a crumpled paper bag. He froze. He pulled it out and unfolded it. Inside were the last remnants of the dried hawthorn. A few berries, some dried leaves. This object was the only material evidence of the deliberately prepared infusion. He stared at the bag for a long time. The paper had grown thin. The berries had turned black. Destroying it could be an act of fear, or an act of completion. He sat on the edge of his bed, the bag resting in his palm, light, almost weightless. The memory of the evening before the meeting returned. He was at the computer in the lab, the screen glowing in the semi-darkness. On the page was a medical website, an article about the effects of hawthorn on elderly patients. He remembered reading the section on safe dosages, 5 grams per 8 ounces. The maximum was 10. An overdose would overload the heart. He remembered thinking, a minimal overdose. He remembered weighing the herbs on the lab scales. 15 grams, exactly. The memory was clear, devoid of emotion. No panic, no rage. The preparation had been deliberate. Tony said it aloud to himself. I knew. It was the first time he had articulated it without excuses. He no longer linked the act solely to John's pressure. The pressure had been the background, the context, the source of his weariness. But he was the one who had made the decision. He hadn't increased the dose on a momentary impulse. He had done it in advance, calmly, rationally, like a biologist correcting an experiment. Late that night, Tony returned to the school. The hallways were empty. He didn't turn on the lights, moving from memory. He went down to the boiler room. The metal steps creaked under his feet. The smell of coal and hot metal filled the space. The boiler room was located directly beneath the lab. It was symbolic. Knowledge above, the destruction of evidence below. He walked to the furnace and opened the hatch. The flames inside burned with a steady glow. He held the bag not as evidence, but as a symbol. He tossed the paper bag into the fire. The flames quickly consumed the paper. The dried herbs flared, blackened, and turned to ash. He watched the process calmly. There was no fear of exposure, no panic, only a sense of finality. He stood before the furnace, watching the fire, the heat warming his face as the smoke rose up the chimney. He admitted it to himself. The act had not been an impulse. He hadn't been in a state of passion. He had chosen the moment, the dose, the consequences. The realization was heavy, but it was clear. For the first time, the decision had been his alone. He closed the furnace door, climbed the steps, and left the boiler room through a separate exit into the schoolyard. The cold air hit his face. He walked across the yard and stopped at the fence, looking out at the town. The low houses, the narrow streets, the lights in the windows. Everything was the same. But he had changed. He was no longer a cultivated plant. He was a person capable of action, even at the cost of a crime. Nolan noted the lack of direct evidence of intent. The concentration of the substance exceeded the norm, but the medical examiner's report allowed for a natural death given the combination of factors: age, stress, and heart failure. The case was quietly closed. The official cause of death was listed as complicated heart failure. The town accepted this version with relief. Principal Grant organized a memorial plaque for John. A dedication ceremony was held in the town square. Residents gathered, gave speeches, thanked him for his help, and recalled his good deeds. Tony stood off to the side, listening in silence. The ledgers filled with debts remained in the archives of the police department. Names, amounts, character assessments. A map of influence. No one mentioned the final entry again. The most successful project, fully formed. A week later, Tony submitted his resignation and a request for a transfer to another city. A larger city, where there was an opening for a biology teacher at a high school. Grant called him into his office. "Why are you leaving, Anthony?" The principal clapped him on the shoulder. "You're valued here. The development fund needs people like you." Tony answered calmly. "Sometimes plants need to grow crooked to become themselves." Grant frowned, not understanding. He nodded uncertainly. "Well, if you've made up your mind, good luck." Tony packed his things, a few clothes, books, several boxes of herbs from the lab. The watch John had given him remained on his desk. He didn't take it. On his last day, he went to the garden one more time. The gate was open. No one was taking care of the plants now. The boxwood shrubs had started to grow unevenly, branches jutting out in different directions. The flower beds were overgrown with weeds. The ground remained dry. The perfect geometry was collapsing. Tony stopped by the bench and looked at the irrigation system, the seized-up spigot, the cracked valve. Order without life was turning into chaos. But in that chaos, something new and alive was emerging. He walked out of the garden and closed the gate without looking back. He walked through the narrow streets of the old town, past John's store, past the town square, past the police station. He stopped at the bus stop and waited for the bus to the station. The town went on living. People went about their business, talking, laughing. No one noticed his departure. On the bus, Tony sat by the window, watching the houses, the shops, the school on the hill float by. Everything grew smaller, more distant. He remembered Maria Vance's words. He cultivated people like they were his shrubs. John had indeed cultivated them. He pruned, guided, and shaped them. Tony was the result of that work. Educated, grateful, obedient. But plants that are pruned for too long lose the ability to grow on their own, or they find a way to break free. The bus left the town limits, the road winding through fields. Trees replaced one another. The horizon expanded. Tony closed his eyes. His breathing was even. His pulse was calm. Inside him remained a troubling clarity. He was not a victim. He was the author. His freedom was founded on a crime. And the most terrifying part was that he felt no panic. He felt only clarity. That evening, Tony arrived in the city. He rented a room in a boarding house for new teachers. It was small but clean, with a window overlooking a park. He unpacked his things, hung up his clothes, and arranged his books on a shelf. He sat at the desk, took out his notebook, and opened it to a clean page. He wrote, "Sometimes plants need to grow crooked to become themselves." He reread it, then closed the notebook. In the town he had left behind, John's garden continued to change. The shrubs lost their shape, the branches grew unevenly, the ground cracked. But after a month, the first sprouts of weeds appeared, wild, uncontrolled. Life was returning. Not perfect, not decorative, just alive. Nolan officially closed the case, signed the papers, and filed the folder in the archive. He sat in his office late one evening, alone, looking out at the square. He understood more than he had recorded, but his job wasn't to punish or to save. It was to document the moment a person confronts himself. Nolan had done that. The rest was Tony's choice. Tony started teaching at the new school. He explained biology to his students, showed them diagrams of plant growth, and talked about photosynthesis. His voice remained even, his gestures minimal. But something fundamental inside him had changed. He made his own decisions, small, everyday ones, but they were his. One day, a student asked, "Mr. Collins, why do plants sometimes grow crooked?" He replied, "Because they're searching for light. The light doesn't always come from above. Sometimes you have to grow crooked to survive." The student nodded and wrote it down. Tony continued the lesson. That evening, he returned to his room, made tea, and sat by the window. He looked out at the park. The trees grew freely, their branches reaching in all directions. No geometry, no control. He understood. Freedom did not absolve him of guilt, but it made the guilt his own. Tony had chosen, committed a crime, and accepted the responsibility. His life now belonged to him, even if the price was the memory of John Miller, lying in a garden where the earth had gone dry, and control had proven to be an illusion. In the small town, the residents gradually forgot the details of their benefactor's death. Only the phrases remained. They don't make them like him anymore. He helped everyone. The memorial plaque in the square gleamed in the rain. The ledgers of debt gathered dust in an archive. The garden became overgrown. The shrubs grew crooked. And in that crookedness, there was a disturbing, frightening freedom.